Okay, so good morning, everybody. You made it, fourth class. Today, I'll just do a brief review in case anybody missed any of the classes. And this class is sort of in some way building off of the first and second week. Last week, we took a little bit of a digression to learn about Eastern Europe and the Hasidic community. But we really started off talking about what creates Jewish modernity. We talked about Spinoza. We talked about the idea starting in the late 1600s, but really the 1700s, that Jews were increasingly joining the general trends of the Enlightenment, rethinking religious ideas, rethinking what it means to believe in God, rethinking what it means to have, the Bible as the center of your religiosity. And then we had continuously mentioned that the entire time for Jews in the Enlightenment, there was sort of a secondary or dual concern, right? So for your average Christian who was going through the Enlightenment, and this is all just a review from week 2, the main questions were mostly theologic and how much power should the church have, and all of these eventual questions that anybody who's taken a general European history class probably has delved into. In the Jewish community, there was this added concern over general emancipation, because as I've mentioned in every class, in the medieval Jewish community, or even in the pre-modern Jewish community, the default assumption was that Jews did not have equal political and social rights. You can go to any city in Western Europe, and even as recent as the late 1700s, any city that you can go to, Jews had to live in a specific area. Jews were relegated to certain jobs. Jews had a curfew that didn't apply to everybody else. So this idea of a 20th or 21st century liberal democracy where everybody has these, inalienable universal rights, those did not apply to Jews yet in the 1700s. But as Jews were increasingly entering into the mainstream, and this is what we saw with Moses Mendelssohn 2 weeks ago, Jews essentially had to make the argument to the Christian mainstream as to why Jews deserve to be treated equally. And so we saw this with Moses Mendelssohn's work, Jerusalem, 2 weeks ago, where Mendelssohn is sort of making the argument. And one of the things that Mendelssohn writes, and Abraham Geiger is going to sort of continue on this trend, is Mendelssohn essentially evokes Christian tradition to try to drive home the point as to why the Christian majority should treat Jews equally. He says, listen, Jesus was Jewish. Jesus also, by everything we know about Jesus, Jesus was a practicing Jew. In other words, Jesus almost certainly kept kosher. Jesus almost certainly celebrated Shabbat. And so Moses Mendelssohn is saying, well, it doesn't make sense that German government are saying that Jews have to stop their own ritualistic laws in order to receive equality, when your own leader of your religion, essentially, we are just practicing Judaism the same way that he was doing. And this was sort of Moses Mendelssohn's great plea for political equality. One other thing, just by review of Mendelssohn, despite Mendelssohn's really monumental task of turning Judaism into a religion, and I'll expand on that a little bit later today, he was still a very staunch adherer to halacha and to Jewish law. And so Mendelssohn writes many times, modernity does not absolve Jews of the need to keep Jewish law. And so if you ask Moses Mendelssohn, do you need to keep kosher? Do you need to keep Jewish holidays? Need to keep Shabbat? Need to keep marital laws? Moses Mendelssohn would say, of course, right? Ritualistic laws in Judaism are still central and important to Judaism. That's obviously going to start to change in the 1800s when we talk about Abraham Geiger. But before we go to the religious side, let's talk a little bit about the political side for a second. I'm going to guess most people here have probably heard of the Jewish question, but in case you haven't, just a brief review of what this question was. As Jews were entering into the mainstream in Europe in the 17 and 1800s, understandably, the majority population was sort of confused over what Jews were, right? Who are these Jews that are all of a sudden coming into the mainstream, right? This is still a question that we in the Jewish community are confused about. Namely, is Judaism a religion? Is Judaism an ethnicity? Is Judaism a nationality, right? Like, what are we? And the honest answer, if we're being honest with ourselves, is that, well, all of these terms are 17 and 1800 terms, and Judaism just simply predates that. And so Judaism just doesn't fit into any of these buckets nicely. But that obviously was not the answer that a lot of Jews in the 17 and 1800s who were trying to make the argument that Jews are just like everybody else, right? They sort of had this direct mission to try to argue that no, Jews are just the same as Christians, just with a couple of different beliefs. And as we'll see, that very much describes a major thrust of Jewish thought in the 1800s. But let's talk a little bit, let's take one more step back. After the French Revolution, France was the first place to grant Jews emancipation. One of the leaders of the French Revolution had this sort of famous or infamous quote, and it goes as follows: "The Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals," right? This very well encapsulates the struggle that Jews were in, right? This really paradox of modernity. Because on the one hand, the path for individual emancipation was there, right? And many, many Jews in the 17 and even more Jews in the 1800s simply converted out of Judaism, right? This was a major trend, especially in places like France and Germany, where many young Jews, right? We can, withhold our moral judgment for a second, but if you are a, 18-year-old Jew and the only way for you to go to the university that you want and to have the job that you want and to have, the house in the neighborhood that you want is to convert out of Judaism, right? Unless there's something very strongly drawing you to Judaism, a lot of people are going to take that, right? And so you have a lot of Jews that are simply converting out of Judaism and becoming, Protestant Christians. And the fun fact, or not so fun fact, is 4 out of 5 of Moses Mendelssohn's own children actually converted out of Judaism and lived as Christians. And so you had, especially for well-educated Jews in Western Europe, a lot of Jews were willing to take this bargain, right? Thrust off Jewish nationhood and just say, I'm not Daniel the Jew, right? I'm Daniel. I'm Daniel the Frenchman, or I'm Daniel the European, right? I should be treated as every other European. The problem, of course, is that if you still valued Judaism, which, we're learning about modern Jewish philosophy, so all the thinkers that we are talking about very much value Judaism, you have to contend with this, right? How do you deal with this tension where Jews as a people are not going to be granted equality, and you also don't want Jews to assimilate? So what do you do, right? So the stereotype of Jews, which, one can argue how true it was, is that the Jews constituted sort of this state within a state, right? This is probably a anti-Semitic trope that many have heard. And this sort of makes a little bit of sense, right? If we just take the historic example, and then I want to do this slide sort of quick so we can get to Avraham Geiger, right? If you were to drop into any Jewish community in the year 1700, right? This is before emancipation, right? You would look in the Jewish community and you would see an insular community that was socially sectioned off from the rest of the world. They not only had their own ritual laws. In other words, Jews would not only keep kosher, but the example that I keep giving is if, Fred hits my car, leaving the supermarket, I'm not taking Fred to the French court. Fred and I are going to Beit Din, and the rabbi is judging who owes what based on Talmudic law. And so not only did Jews have their own social spheres and their own neighborhoods, Jews also had their own legal systems, right? And so Jews kind of did constitute, in some way, a state within a state. In other words, there was nothing about Jews in France in the year 1700 that made Jews French, right? They didn't have social interaction with your average Frenchman. They didn't have the same laws as the rest of the people in France, right? So they just so happened to live in the same geographic borders as Christian Frenchmen. But for many people, the Jews weren't, absorbed in part of France. They were this, sort of weird sub-nation within this group. And, one can argue about if that's a good thing or why, but that was the case. And so Jews were often, in the early days of trying to argue for emancipation, the Jews were accused of this idea of dual loyalty, right? This is sort of an accusation that has stuck for the last couple hundred years. But dual loyalty essentially was, well, why would Jews be loyal to France or Germany or any of these other countries? The Jews are kind of doing their own thing there, right? They have their own laws, they have their own structures. And also, right, the leaders of these countries weren't stupid. The leaders of Germany knew that your average German Jew felt more kinship to a Jew in France than he did to a non-Jew in Germany. In other words, if you dropped into a random Jewish community in the year 1800 and you asked a German Jew, who do you feel more connection to? Your neighbor down the street who's Christian, or a Jew who you've never met living in Paris? The vast majority of Jews would probably say, well, of course, the Jew I've never met in Paris, right? We consider this today, a beautiful blessing of Jewish peoplehood, but for people that were trying to argue that Jews shouldn't be emancipated, this was seen as yeah, the Jews don't actually have any loyalty to your average Frenchman or your average German. We had discussed in a past class for AOI, so I don't want to go into this, Napoleon's supposed answer to this, where he convened a group of rabbis and set up what he called the Sanhedrin, and attempted to force the Jewish community to answer these series of questions. But this debate was very much alive in the Jewish community. And of course, the one easy way to get out of this, which is the way that many Jewish thinkers took, starting with Moses Mendelssohn, is to argue, no, you have it all wrong. The only reason why the Jews are constituting this state within a state or a nation is because of political necessity. But once Jews are emancipated, Germans or Frenchmen, you will see that Jews are just like us. We just have slightly different beliefs. In other words, starting with Moses Mendelssohn, there was this very concerted effort to say, Judaism is just a religion. We don't have any of the political or national or ethnic claims that one might think your average medieval Jewish community had. And once Jews are adopted into the mainstream, you'll see that Jews are 99% the same as Protestant Germans. We just have, very slightly different beliefs. And so that was already Moses Mendelssohn's answer. But in drops Abraham Geiger, who's going to become probably the most influential Jewish figure of the 1800s, certainly for the Jewish world today, when we think about the Reform movement still being the largest movement in America. And before talking about how Geiger is going to answer this question, a little bit about Abraham Geiger's background. Abraham Geiger was one of the founding members of this school called the Wissenschaft to Judaism. And essentially, this was an early German Jewish attempt to begin the academic study of Judaism. And so until Geiger and until the school in Germany, the only view of Judaism that anybody had was the traditional quote unquote Orthodox view of Judaism. But all of a sudden you have a flux of German Jews attempting to make the argument that Judaism should be understood just like any other science or any other academic discipline. Now, this obviously came with a lot of tension, because if you are more right-wing on the Orthodox to liberal spectrum, you would say, well, Judaism is fundamentally different than the way that we understand, Chinese history, because Chinese history is history and Judaism is truth, right? But for the practitioners of the Wissenschaft of Judaism, they said, well, that's sort of an irrelevant distinction, right? This is where the Enlightenment comes into play. They said, we need to use all the tools at our disposal of the modern scientific world, and modern, 1820s, 1830s, to actually figure out, what is this Judaism? What is Jewish history? What is myth? What is fact? All of that. And so Abraham Geiger, in his early days, he actually started off his career much more as an academic than a rabbi. He was classically trained as a rabbi, but there were, there's a lot of evidence that Geiger had actually wanted to become a professor at a university in Germany. The only problem was that Jews were not allowed to be professors at universities in Germany when Geiger was, in his formative teenage and in his 20s. And so a lot of historians think that Geiger was sort of forced into becoming a rabbi, and, he obviously made huge changes in the Jewish community. And it might actually be because of some historic accident where he wasn't allowed to take up a professorship. Early on in his 20s, one of the interesting things about Abraham Geiger is already from his late teenage years, you can sort of tell that he was going to be a future change maker. He has a letter to a friend where he writes, and this, it's funny when you read this quote, because this doesn't seem radical for 2025, but this was radical for 1825, right? So he says, for the love of heaven, how much longer can we continue this deceit to expound the stories of the Bible from the pulpits over and over again as historical happenings, to accept as supernatural events of world importance, stories which we ourselves have relegated to the realm of legend, and to derive teachings from them, or at least use them as the basis for sermons and texts. So Abraham Geiger, in his younger years, is already complaining about this sort of dichotomy that he's seeing in the Jewish world, where once the academic study of Judaism, and I'll mention Christianity also, because they were obviously also Protestant scholars trying to understand where the Bible came from and biblical history and archaeology and all of that, for Geiger's point of view, it was sort of obvious at some point that some of the stories, say in the Torah, were not actually historical happenings, right? let's take the 6 days of creation, right? Or the massive flood that supposedly covered the whole world. For Geiger, the academic world had long shown that these stories cannot be literally true. Yet what he was noticing is when you showed up to synagogue, right, the only option was essentially, quote unquote traditional, right? They didn't have Orthodox or Reform or any of these denominations yet because this predates it. And so Geiger was noticing that it just seemed like the entire Jewish world was almost in this dichotomy where the academics were saying one thing and about the quote unquote historic truth of Judaism, and the religious preachers were holding on to these vestiges of stories. And he goes even further and he says, many of the rabbis actually understand this, and yet they still continue preaching from the pulpit something different than what they actually believe, right? It's a very interesting statement by Geiger. And so Geiger is going to throw himself into his early years, throw himself into the academic study of Judaism, right? He becomes very interested in trying to understand Jewish history. And this is later on, in 1 second, we'll see how this ended up tailoring his eventual reformation of Judaism. But just to get a little bit more of an overview, right, the Wissenschaft of Judaism was a 19th century Jewish German movement that really applied all of the best tools of academia to Jewish studies. It emerged during the Haskalah, right? We talked about the Haskalah a few weeks ago. And one of the other aims of this, right, it wasn't sort of purely academic in the sense of full detachment, but the Wissenschaft school very much wanted to defend Judaism as a rational, ethical, and historically rich tradition. Now, the reason for that, almost certainly, is because at the same time, you had a lot of Protestant Germans, right, the school is all in Germany, argue that Judaism is made up of a bunch of, mishmash folklore, and this is why Jews don't deserve emancipation. And so one of the things that the Wissenschaft school did is the Wissenschaft school said, no, Judaism has just as tight theology and just as good ideas, if not even better at times, than Protestantism, and all of that, mythical folklore stuff, right? That was just sort of like an accident of history, right? The most obvious way in which the Wissenschaft school did this is in the study of Kabbalah, right? I've spoken this before in terms of, Gershom Scholem and how he rekindled the academic study of Kabbalah, but the Wissenschaft school essentially ignored the entire Kabbalistic tradition. In their study of Jewish history, Kabbalah was sort of an irrelevant sideshow, whereas if you ask, a 21st century Jewish historian, Kabbalah had just as much of a role to play in Judaism in the last 1,000 years as really anything else. But the Wissenschaft school sort of had a polemical aim here. And just going a little bit further, right, there was also an integrationist or a semi-assimilationist mission of the Wissenschaft school, right? The practitioners of Wissenschaft wanted Jews to integrate into European intellectual life. Just a couple of key figures. You have Heinrich Gratz, who was, really the first modern Jewish historian, right? His books of history are still, most of the time, if you're studying Jewish history, you read what he has to say, and then you read other scholars say why everything he has to say is incorrect, right? That's pretty common with founders of a lot of fields. You have Leopold Zunz, who very much, took the Talmud and started applying critical methods to the Talmud. And of course, Abraham Geiger at the bottom there. And the Wissenschaft school is really credited with leading to both the Reform and the conservative movement. And I would also say the modern Orthodox movement as well, because modern Orthodoxy, I'm not talking about ultra-Orthodoxy, but modern Orthodoxy essentially was a backlash to the Wissenschaft school. We could talk about that a little bit later. And so just to talk about Geiger's academic study, because this in some way is going to very much tailor his reforms. He wrote his doctorate on the Jewish origins of Islam. And he wrote this fascinating work called What Did Muhammad Borrow from Judaism? This is still credited at sparking the field of Islamic studies. This is really seen by many as the first academic Islamic work really in history. And for Geiger, right, he writes this fascinating work. For anybody here who's read the Quran or the Hadiths, which if you've never read the Quran or the Hadiths, right, it's interesting to peruse them. One of the things that you're stunned at, especially if you have deep knowledge of the Tanakh and Midrash, is that there's a lot of similarities, right? It's not just, okay, everybody knows that there's also a story of the Akedah and the Quran. And, there's a lot of stories about Abraham or Ibrahim and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, right? Yeah, a lot of the stories are the same, but even to the point where you have many midrashim, right, rabbinic commentaries that were created in Babylonia in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, right? So right at the advent of when Islam would have started. And you read many of the hadiths, right, the supposed oral commentary or sayings of Muhammad, and there's a lot of similarities. And so Geiger started off his academic career with pointing out and him saying, hey, it seems like there's a lot of Judaism at the core of Islam. And this was part of his wider polemic. I mean, again, it's always sort of hard to know how much of this is pure academics, how much of this is polemical. But one of Geiger's main points was to show, these big monotheistic religions, and we'll talk about Christianity in a second, they actually owe their intellectual origins to Judaism. So rather than Judaism, right, because the view of Judaism, if you ask your average German in 1820, what is Judaism? They would have said Judaism is an anachronistic, right, old form, right? It's the people of the Old Testament, the people that are, very anal about legal norms, right? The Pharisees, right, with all the negative stereotypes about who the Pharisees are. And Judaism never really had any deep ideas. Judaism was just about practicing this outdated form of practice, right? This was actually Immanuel Kant's exact view of Judaism. We saw this 2 weeks ago. And one of Geiger's main points and one of the Wissenschaft school's main points was to say, you guys have it all wrong. It's Judaism that crystallized a lot of these ideas, right? So we talk about monotheism, right? How Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are these great monotheistic religions. That's because of Judaism, right? And so we'll see how this, right, this obviously has a lot stronger polemical ties when talking about Christianity. We'll talk about that in a second. But his first major academic work involved the Jewish underpinnings of Islam. He then, when he was 25, founded the Scientific Journal for Jewish Theology, was one of the main Jewish studies journals at the time. And then he quickly started doing work on different layers of history in the Talmud. Now, this seems sort of dry and boring, but one of the things that Geiger argued, which again, today is like so obvious that even putting it on a slide kind of seems almost comical, but this was radical for his time, is saying, hey, rabbinic literature is very dynamic. In other words, the rabbis in the Mishnah don't seem like they're doing the same thing as the rabbis in the Talmud. The rabbis in Babylonia don't seem like they're doing the same thing as the rabbis in Israel. It's almost as if we have a lot of opinions within Judaism, and those opinions evolve, and they are dynamic, and they interact with each other, and that Judaism, as opposed to being this static thing that doesn't change, Judaism is this dynamic thing that constantly changes, right? Again, it's one of those things where you're all sitting there saying, duh, right? But for Abraham Geiger writing this in the 1830s, when most people, if you ask your average, traditional rabbi, they would have said, no, both the Torah and the Talmud and the medieval commentaries, all of that goes back to one time at Sinai, right? There's many statements in rabbinic literature saying, anything that was ever taught was given to Moses by God at Mount Sinai. And the rest of Jewish history is sort of people discovering that one layer at a time. Geiger, from a historical perspective, says, of course that's not the case. It seems like as different things unfold within Jewish history, Judaism and Jewish law and Jewish practice and Jewish belief simply changes. And so for Geiger, eventually his project that, sorry, did I cut out for a sec? There we go. Sorry, I'll take a step back.
Yes,
Geiger is not.
It cut off, but you're back.
Oh, perfect. Geiger is not going to say, I'm coming up with this crazy new thing where Judaism changes and reforms. Geiger is going to say, we have lost this long, deep tradition of Jewish change and reform, and I am rekindling that. In other words, what Geiger is trying to do, and you can, at home be the judge as to how accurate this is, but he's not saying I'm doing something radically different. He's saying I am reclaiming something that used to be the modus operandi of Judaism, but has now been lost. And his major path of doing this was, again, through the study of Jewish history, specifically on rabbinic literature. He then starts creating new prayer books and liturgical texts aligned with modern values. The first non-Orthodox, quote unquote, Siddur or prayer book was authored by Avraham Geiger. We can say a lot more on that, but I want to get to probably the most interesting thing that he does. He writes this massive work on Jesus. And, you can see this picture here. This was written by a scholar named Susanna Heschel. It's a biography of Geiger's work, and it's called Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus. And you have this very provocative figure of Jesus on the cross wearing a talit, right? What is this about? So Abraham Geiger makes the argument, the historic argument, that is still used, by the way, in the field of Christian studies. And he says that Jesus was a Pharisee. Why is this so radical? This is radical for a number of reasons. One, for anyone who's read the New Testament, Pharisee is a bad word, right? You don't want to be the Pharisees. The Pharisees in the New Testament are the stuck-up, anal rabbis who are, constantly, yelling at Jesus for wanting to enact all these reforms, right? Pharisee in the rest of Christian history has this very negative connotation, right? Jews were called Pharisees, right? To call Jesus a Pharisee is essentially to call Jesus, in some sense, a practicing Jew, which historically probably accurate. But again, what Christian wants to hear that their founder of their religion is the thing that they deplore? What else was Avraham Geiger arguing? He was able to sort of kill two birds with one stone. The Pharisees, as Geiger argues, and is now accepted as historical mainstream, the Pharisees were precursors to the rabbis of the Mishnah, right? The rabbis of the Talmud. The rabbis of the Talmud, as Geiger and many people note, right? They were change makers. They were reformers. And so Avraham Geiger argues that Jesus wasn't actually trying to start his own religion, that Jesus was well within the mainstream of Jewish activity in the 1st and 2nd century. And it was Paul who actually started this other religion called Judaism and actually argued for the abolishment of Jewish law and actually argued for, the neither Jew nor Gentile. But Geiger argues that that Jesus, who was Jesus? Jesus was a religious Jew who was interested in religious reform. In other words, right, this is the most radical formulation. If you want to know what religion Jesus would practice, should Jesus be reincarnated in Germany in the 1830s and 40s, Jesus would be a Reform Jew, right? A Jew from the dynamic rabbinic tradition, interested in religious reform, more focused on the ethical and social imperatives of Judaism. He writes this book. Obviously, this has a lot of negative backlash in both the wider Christian and Jewish community, but this very much speaks to a lot of the work that Geiger was trying to do in terms of both tying his academic and his social mission together. If anyone's interested in this point, by the way, I highly recommend reading this book, Avraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus. It's a fascinating work by Susanna Heschel. I think she wrote it almost 30 years ago, but it really holds up. It's an incredible book. So with all this in the background, it's probably a pretty easy leap to understanding how eventually the reform movement really got kicked into major gear by Avraham Geiger. Now, just a couple of brief biographic points. Avraham Geiger probably wasn't the first Reform Jew, but he was the first leader of Reform Judaism. In other words, the seeds of reform had been planted in Germany and other Western European countries, even when, Avraham Geiger was still in diapers, but there was no centralized leadership, right? There was no mission or platform or, wider ideas or conferences or journals as to what Reform Judaism was really going to be. Reform Judaism started up bottom up, right? It was certain communities that started making, certain changes. But Geiger was really the first person to say, this is a movement. If this is a movement, we have to figure out what we stand for. What are we doing? How are we going to decide on some of these big picture decisions? And the reform movement, at least in the 1800s, we can best think of it as a mixture of three things. It's Judaism plus Enlightenment ideas plus acceptance of host state. Let's break that down. Judaism, right? We probably all know what that is. Enlightenment ideas, in other words, the ideas of both the scientific enlightenment and also Immanuel Kant, right? What does scientific enlightenment mean? In other words, ideas such as age of the universe and Darwinian evolution and all of these ideas, for Reform thinkers, these were obviously ideas that needed to be incorporated into Judaism, right? Judaism had to exist side by side with the best of the scientific world. Judaism can't ignore science and academia and all of that. What else does it mean in terms of Immanuel Kant's ideas of universal reason and categorical imperative that we saw 2 weeks ago with Moses Mendelssohn? Early Reform thinkers are going to argue that rituals in their narrow particularistic form don't make much sense, right? The early Reform movement was pretty radically antinomian. In other words, the early Reform movement, there was obviously some debate. We can touch on that in a second. But early Reform thinkers did not hold much value, if any, for Jewish ritual practices. In other words, if it's something you're only doing because, quote unquote, God or the Torah or the rabbi said so, early reformers said, well, this makes no sense. Let's throw that out or let's repackage that. The only thing that's of value in Judaism, we'll talk about this a little bit more, is the kernel of truth that's at the root of Jewish practice, which is the ideas and the beliefs, right? In other words, in changing Judaism into a religion, Abraham Geiger and Moses Mendelssohn did this before, and other thinkers in the 1800s are going to have to continue and build off of this. You have to argue that if Judaism's a religion requires beliefs and dogmas and ideas. And so therefore, Judaism has certain ideas, right? This is probably different than the way that most pre-modern Jewish communities acted, where it was a lot more fluid, right? Beliefs weren't talked about that much. Values weren't talked about that much. It was action, right? It was mitzvot. It was halacha, right? Jewish law. It was all the other sort of, particulars of Jewish life and practice. Abraham Geiger is going to make the argument that no, that was just a sideshow, right? The ritual practice. The main point of Judaism is the ideas. The last part of this, the acceptance of host state, was, again, one of the more controversial elements of the Reform movement at its time, which was to say, in turning Judaism into a religion, Abraham Geiger was making the argument Jews can have full loyalty to whatever host state they're in, be it Germany or France or eventually the United States, because Judaism is just a religion and there's no such thing, Geiger was making the point, as Jewish peoplehood. So one of the things, actually the most controversial thing that Geiger was ever involved in, I'll give you sort of the negative and then we can go positive. In the 1840s, there was a situation involving Jews in Damascus. It's called the Damascus Affairs, where there was a blood libel that happened in the Syrian Jewish community, and many Jewish communities in both America. This is the fun fact of American Jewish history, is this is the first time that the American Jewish community, right? This is in the 1840s, a very small American Jewish community of mostly actually German Jews, but the first time the American Jewish community collectively advocated for something was to acquit the people accused of this blood libel in the Damascus Affairs. When this came across Geiger's desk, his response was essentially, this doesn't concern us at all, right? These are, people that live in Syria. This has nothing to do with what we're doing here as religious Jews in Germany. In other words, Geiger did not, right, the idea of Jewish people or Jewish nationhood bore no part of Geiger's self-understanding of Judaism. And again, it's sort of easy to see why. If Judaism is a religion based off of certain ideas, right, that can be practiced anywhere, why should you feel a knee-jerk internal kinship for other Jews across the world, right? One might say the same thing, right? Your average, I would imagine, Protestant doesn't feel the same kinship to a Protestant living halfway across the world as today your average Jew might feel for an average Jew living across the world. And so Geiger, again, very much attempted to shift Judaism from peoplehood, nation, all of these other things to just sort of a pure type religion. And again, because he was in Germany at the time, the sort of model of what Judaism should look like is much more Protestant based. And he makes, just to say this one more time, for him, the ideas of Judaism were the most important part, not the halacha. And he coins this term called ethical monotheism, where you still often hear this in Reform circles today. And in doing this, again, he's able to say that both Christianity and Islam, in other words, the West, actually owes its intellectual and spiritual roots to Judaism. And so you can imagine him making this argument to the German mainstream. He's saying, rather than you throwing out Judaism and trying to convert all Jews to Protestantism, you should actually value Judaism, because not only was Jesus a Reform Jew, quote unquote, right, a Pharisee, but the values that German society and Western society and Protestantism are practicing, this idea of everybody created in the image of one God and having universal values and universal, universal benefit of all people being created equal. He said that was always Judaism's main idea. He says, yes, for historic reasons, right? This gets back into the historical part. For historic reasons, Judaism underwent a number of pivots and became hyper-focused on legalism, right? Hyper-focused on halacha. He actually does a good amount to blame Christianity for that, right? He says it's the medieval period where Judaism becomes just utterly fixated on Jewish law and halacha and all of these, tiny nuances of Jewish practice. And he says, well, the main reason for that is because of persecution, right? When persecution happens, Jews just become more insular and more fixated on Judaism. But he says, Judaism in its, pure form, quote unquote, is this multifaceted, tradition of practice, but it's the ideas that are really at its core. And so just to read one quote, and then we'll go back a little bit. So he writes this book, and at the end he concludes by saying as follows. He says, "So too, my Israelite, be very mindful of the pure and genuine grain of wheat in your faith, of the pure fear of God, so that you will work in behalf of the welfare of mankind. The outer shell, the ritual forms, are but the bearer of the Spirit, in which the Spirit becomes visible, and by which it may mature. But do not forget that they are of no further use to piety once they no longer bear the Spirit within them. Times and circumstances change and necessitate many modifications and new institutions which, in keeping with contemporary circumstances, are needed to keep our religion alive. All that changes is the outer shell. Only some outward forms undergo modification. The essence remains intact." In other words, for Geiger, the essence of Judaism was the beliefs and ideas. What are the ideas? That there's one God, that one God gives humanity a unique ethical mission, that all humans are created in the image of God, so all humans have, basic inalienable rights from God, that humans must work to better the world, right? Social action and all of these things. That's the core of Judaism, according to Geiger, right? Understandably, in his survey of Jewish history, the figures that Geiger, quote unquote, likes are people like Isaiah and Jeremiah, right? And because in Geiger's mind, right, they understood this, right? Isaiah's criticism of the temple features very heavily in Geiger's work, right? Pretty obviously as to why. And so Geiger is saying, the outer forms, that's the ritual. So things like keeping kosher and things like, practicing Shabbat, Geiger would say, that might have been necessary to keep the ideas going over the long trek of Jewish history. But now we've sort of outdone the value in the outer ritual form. And now Judaism can sort of return to its pure roots. One of the interesting things, I'll add one or two more comments, and then I think I do have a few more slides, but we can take some thoughts and questions because I've said a lot. One of the interesting things about a lot of Jewish movements in the 18 and 1900s is almost all Jewish movements, Hasidic Judaism is the same, Reform Judaism is the same, eventually Zionism will be the same, modern Orthodoxy will be the same. They're not actually arguing to change Judaism. What they're arguing is that there's some pure idea or core of Judaism that has been lost because of history, and we are reclaiming it, right? So if you ask your average Zionist, they are not saying we're trying to do this radically different thing. They're saying the core of Judaism is a people in its ancestral homeland. That was the core. Everything else that happened in Judaism, that was because of historic accident. We are reclaiming that core. For Geiger, same thing, just a different core. For Geiger, the core of Judaism is these ideas and morals and ethics, and everything else that happened in Judaism was historic accident, and we are reclaiming the core, right? The same thing with Hasidic Judaism. The core of Judaism is, devekut, is sticking to God, clinging to God. Everything else that happened in Judaism, right, that was a historic mistake. We are reclaiming the core, right? It's a fascinating polemic argument. It should also give you skepticism whenever you meet somebody in the modern Jewish community and they say, my version of Judaism is the sort of essence of Judaism, and everybody else is sort of doing it wrong, right? You can kind of run through a couple of examples there. But this is Geiger's essential argument is we are reclaiming the core of Judaism. The core of Judaism is a religion that seems much more like Protestantism. But then the last thing that he does, because oftentimes you hear this will be the last thing I say before pausing for questions, you oftentimes hear, and I'll unshare my screen for a second, you oftentimes hear people say, well, the Reform movement just tried to copy Christianity and, it was some mixture of Christianity and Judaism. That might be somewhat true, but the other part that they're missing is part of this argument is that Christianity is a Jewish movement. And so for Avraham Geiger, the core ideas at the root of Christianity were actually just taken from Judaism. And so, yes, Avraham Geiger and early reformers were somewhat infatuated by, Protestant intellectualism, but it's only because they believed that Protestant intellectualism was actually Jewish intellectualism. So it's a fascinating switch and a reversal of, before Geiger, you had all these Protestant Christian thinkers who were saying, Protestants, we are the people that have the quote unquote, the moral ideas and the ethical ideas and the intellectual ideas. And Judaism, those are just a bunch of insular people that are following some, folklorish set of rituals that, are sort of outdated. What Geiger is saying is, no, no, no. Judaism is the tradition that had all these core ideas and values and everything. And yes, for a variety of reasons, Christianity and then Islam took these ideas and ran with it and created their own religious traditions. And then because of persecution against Jews, Judaism lost sight at points in its history on the ethical core and began to focus more on ritual. But that was only because of anti-Semitism and persecution. Now Judaism is rekindling this. And of course, Judaism should be then well accepted and lauded within the German mainstream. So this is most of Geiger's argument. I will pause for any and all questions and comments. And if there are no questions or comments, we can keep going a little bit.
I have one question.
Oh, go for it.
I was curious about how the Protestants or the Christians took the book that he wrote about Jesus. And I think, from time to time throughout the Middle Ages to now, seems like you wouldn't want to step so firmly into criticizing Christianity or even mentioning Jesus' name because you'd be worried about your physical safety. And yet this sounds like something that could have really gotten him in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I mean, this was before. I mean, I guess there was a brief interlude in Germany for about 100 years where, Jews were pretty safe between 1820 and 1920 or 1830 and 1930. So there was never a question of physical danger, and Moses Mendelssohn was sort of doing something similar, 50 years earlier. Nobody liked his ideas, so his ideas were essentially, very negative, both across the Protestant and then eventually the Catholic world. What's interesting is today, if you go to like a liberal Christian seminary, so liberal Protestantism in America, of which there's many, seminaries, many people essentially adopt Geiger's outlook. And so today, Geiger is quoted very frequently across, especially like liberal Christian journals for understanding, because before this, just to take a little bit, we can do a little bit of a deep dive into his scholarship. All of the scholarship that was done on Jesus, right? Because there was an equivalent movement in Christianity, right? You had Protestant scholars trying to figure out what's the historicity of Jesus. Who was Jesus really? How do you deal with contradictions within the Gospels in the New Testament? But they had no understanding of the Jewish community, right? They had no understanding of the Second Temple period. They had very little understanding of the Mishnah, which is, again, the same historic period as Jesus and the apostles and everything there. And so Geiger essentially opened up the field of Christian studies to saying, if you really want to understand what was happening in the Galilee or Jerusalem in the 2nd century CE, you probably have to open the Mishnah also, because these were, rabbis, answering this. And the stereotypes of Jews or Pharisees in the New Testament, right, that's, polemical and religious, but that's not historically accurate. And so there was definitely a mix. I mean, again, his work was not lauded by most Christian scholars, but he definitely started this conversation. And I don't believe he had to flee. There was any feeling that his safety was going to be in check. But it was sort of a pretty bold argument to be making there as well. So Yeah, 100%. Rhea, go for it.
Okay, so as you're talking about this, I'm reading Constantine's Sword, which is in a sense a historical look at the thinking that you're talking about, and he's looking at the in intrinsic anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish part of Christianity. And it's fascinating because it's following some of the things without naming. He doesn't name Geiger, but it is in that sense. And I don't know if in modern Christian communities, if they begin to latch onto the idea that Jesus was Jewish, but he takes it into the Gospels, not some of their views and the twisting of concepts. So I don't know if he is say a just child of Geiger's thinking.
Oh, interesting. It could be. I mean, I think that this was. I mean, Jews had known this for a long time. I mean, this is sort of like there is sort of a meta debate to be had. This is always whenever I teach at UCI, and I have students that obviously, range the full gamut of religious backgrounds. There's no conversation. I actually find it a lot easier to teach about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than I do about this one point. This is just how much internally I'm feel like I'm walking on eggshells because most students at say UC Irvine are coming from a Christian background, right? There's a lot of students that come from Catholic backgrounds, right? A lot of Hispanic students or Black students that are coming from Christian backgrounds, and so the last thing I want to do is say that like Christianity is inherently anti-Semitic, and it's actually a feature of Christianity, not a bug, which I believe is one of the arguments that at least some make. I have never read Constantine's Sword, but there is sort of a view among scholars that that's the case. On the other hand, if you read passages from the New Testament and then you read Augustine and then you read, medieval church fathers, it's very difficult to separate some pure Christian, center from anti-Semitism because supersessionism, right? This idea that Christianity is sort of the new Jews and there's a new Jerusalem and they're the new church and, God has turned their back on the Jews. That was part of the essential claim that Paul was making. And so it's very difficult to have this conversation. I mean, here it's a lot easier. But always whenever students ask me about this, it's like, I'm on full alert to like, all right, I gotta word this very carefully. And it's sort of this open question. I mean, the one thing that I'll say that I think might alleviate the difficulty a little bit is that in the second century, right, when, most of the New Testament was being written, that predates Christians having any actual power. And so I always say it's one thing to write negatively about a group if you have no power. It's another if you have power over them. In other words, if Paul, who was, Paul was also coming from the Jewish community, if Paul is writing about the Pharisees, these are stiff-necked people who are unwilling to accept truth. I don't love that he said that, but at least, you can understand, Paul had no institutional power, and he's looking at the rabbis who essentially did have, not a ton, but the rabbis were the leaders of the Jewish community, and he's frustrated. He's saying, come on, guys, this is the new idea, get with it. In the 4th and 5th century, once, Constantine, converts Rome into Christianity, all of a sudden now that there is institutional power and a lot of institutional power and armies and, everything we know about Christian history, if Christian leaders are still saying, well, even Paul said this about Jews, that makes it a lot more difficult because now Jews are this unprotected minority. So I think that all of those questions have to bear in here. But Geiger, I think, was willing to sort of like stare straight into this and to say, to argue quite convincingly that if you want to accept, if you want to understand Jesus as a historical phenomenon, you have to understand Judaism and you have to respect Judaism, which I think was sort of the important caveat because he's saying, rather than Judaism being this, again, this anachronistic set of, rituals that nobody practices, he's saying that reform or, that the core of Judaism, which he then calls Reform Judaism, or it's later called Reform Judaism, that Jesus was a Reform Jew, right? So you want to live, practice the religion of Jesus, become a Reform Jew, right? Obviously that's, not something Jews or Christians want to hear, right? Which is, part of the interesting part of Geiger is he's sort of willing to upset everybody. And he definitely, had many enemies in the Jewish community as well as the Christian community. But, oftentimes it's, hard. If you want to be a good scholar, you're going to probably upset people. Mindy, go for it. I think you're on mute.
I think you muted me or unmuted me at the same time I unmuted. Um, Thank you, Rabbi. I'm glad to join this class. This is my first time here. And I guess I was surprised to hear so much about Geiger because I grew up in Cincinnati, and Cincinnati is the home of American Reform Judaism. And I was always told Isaac M. Wise, the rabbi, started all of this. And so I guess I'm curious, what is the connection between the two? And
Yeah,
is it
it's a really
covered in
great
another
question.
place?
Yeah. So, the earliest Jews, I'll give you like the brief summary. The earliest Jews to the Americas were Sephardic Jews that were, kind of coming from New Amsterdam, Amsterdam to New Amsterdam. And then there were some very early, Jewish merchants or peddlers that came in the early 1800s. But really, it wasn't until the 1840s that you had these masses of German Jews come to America. So, between 1830 and 1860, there were tens, if not maybe 100,000. I haven't looked at the numbers in a while of German Jews who moved to America, which is why Reform Judaism ended up being the first major movement here, right? It wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s that the Eastern European Jews all started moving here. And that's when the conservative movement starts to grow and everything. So the American Reform movement, very much dovetails off the German Reform movement. The first, and one of the interesting things about the early American Jewish community is there weren't any rabbis. So America was often seen as like the Wild West of the Jewish world. And so the American Reform movement very much owes its, origins to the German Reform movement. It obviously split off in some, interesting ways. I can pull up here. Let's see how fast I can find it. Give me 2 seconds. This is the one benefit of being on a computer and not in person. So here we can look at the American Pittsburgh platform and just parts of it. So this is
That I'm
1880.
familiar with.
Yeah, so this is 85. Just for everyone else, Geiger is writing in the 30s and 40s, and I think he dies in the 1870s. So Geiger is one generation before the Pittsburgh platform, which obviously the Reform movement in America didn't start with the Pittsburgh platform, but it was the 1870s and 1880s that I think HUC opened in Cincinnati sometime in the 1870s or 1880s, somewhere around there. So definitely a generation later. But this is very much, right? Like you can read Geiger in this, right? So this is just excerpts of the Pittsburgh platforms. The rabbis in Pittsburgh write, we recognize in the Mosaic legislation, in other words, the Torah, a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine, and today we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. We hold that all Mosaic and rabbinic laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct rather than to further spiritual development. So, very much the rabbis in Pittsburgh with the American Reform movement were building off of this sort of Abraham Geiger approach of the ideas are important, the practice actually ends up hurting at times. And the one other interesting thing is in the early Reform movement, this is both in Germany and then it came to America, there still was a debate. So it wasn't that, okay, once you throw away Jewish law, it's everything. Geiger is considered by historians as a moderate Reform Jew. There were others who were saying, well, maybe we should move Shabbat to Sunday, right? Maybe that would be easier for Jews because Sunday is the day of rest, right? Christians will go to church, Jews will go to synagogue. Geiger was against that. Geiger rallied pretty heavily to keep Shabbat on Saturday. Now, Geiger wouldn't say, make sure not to cook or light a fire on Shabbat, but he definitely wanted people showing up to synagogue on Shabbat, right? He was a rabbi. He was, and so you did have these debates with others, both in Germany and in America. Circumcision was another one. Geiger's views on circumcision were a little bit mixed, but I think at the end of the day, he was still slightly more pro-circumcision than other early Reform rabbis who were utterly against it. And so, but yeah, so there are a lot of names here, but Rabbi Weiss was sort of like one generation later. But it's a great question because obviously in America, still today, the Reform movement is the largest movement. And so, it kind of very much came across the Atlantic with the German Jews. Now, obviously, I mean, I don't think I need to say this, but in case I do, the Reform movement of 2025 is very different than the Reform movement of Germany in 1830 or Pittsburgh of 1885. Probably the biggest difference is around Zionism, which is one interesting shift that this wasn't just Geiger. Maybe this will be an interesting way to end. After Geiger and the Wissenschaft School began, their new views of Judaism, two other movements sort of popped up that were parallel or oppositional to what Geiger was doing. One was what eventually becomes modern Orthodoxy. So there was a Rabbi, Simson Raphael Hirsch, who agreed with Geiger that Judaism needs to become more religious-like and accept its host state. So Simson Raphael Hirsch also would have been considered an early anti-Zionist, even though political Zionism didn't really exist, but the idea that Jews are fine where they are, right? Jews don't need some other place. But Shimshon Raphael Hirsch said, Judaism needs to maintain its very strict legal form, right? So he was a full Orthodox Jew in the sense of Jewish law and Jewish practice, but he was modern in the sense of Judaism needs to adopt into modernity and to accept, the laws of Germany and German culture and German dress and German, academia and all of that. And then the conservative movement with a German rabbi named Zachariah Frankel sort of paved the middle path, where Zachariah Frankel said, well, Geiger was kind of right about the idea that Judaism historically develops, right? That's sort of, for Zachariah Frankel, that seemed obvious. And so Jewish law needs to evolve and develop, but we can't throw out Jewish law, right? Like we need Jewish law, but there has to be a evolutionary process to Jewish law. And this was called the historical positivist school, because they said, yes, Judaism is a historic phenomenon, but Jewish law is still binding, but Jewish law needs to slowly evolve and change. So this sort of ended up becoming the Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox movements all in Germany. Now, again, these movements all got imported to America, right, due to immigration. And so eventually, in America, right, with HUC and then JTS and then eventually, YU in New York, you can kind of directly trace how these movements came across, from across the Atlantic. But Geiger very much, in a lot of ways, started this conversation. Moses Mendelssohn did before, but Mendelssohn, if we remember from 2 weeks ago, Mendelssohn still held Jewish law as completely binding. And so Geiger was the first person to systematically write about how, maybe Jewish law needs to change and the rituals aren't that important, and to very much, again, shape the way that many of us see Judaism today, whether we agree or disagree. That's sort of beyond the point. Ramarsha, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you, Daniel. I just a thought. First of all, I want to say welcome again to everybody. And Mindy, I'm so happy to see you. It's been a long time, and I'm delighted you found this class. I hope you'll come back. You can, any of you who are new, you can access the recordings of the previous 3 classes on our YouTube channel. So I hope you'll do that. Wouldn't you say, Daniel, that actually Hirsch, even though he was an adherent to tradition, really would have been in some ways the first conservative rabbi, in terms of he had a progressive stance that I think belies modern orthodoxy. And if you even read his commentaries now on the Torah, his commentary is one of my favorite things to read, even today. Can you imagine that he would have been, I guess I just wanted to ask you about that, because I think that he would have been just like the leading conservative thinker in America if he, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
No, he might have. I mean, the sort of, other piece of this is, there we go. The other piece of this is that in 2025, these movements have all sort of shifted. So the modern Orthodox movement, arguably now in 2025, is slightly more Orthodox than modern, right? Certainly Raphael Hirsch would be to the left I think, of a lot of the mainstream modern Orthodox community. What separated him from Zacharias Frankel is that, and from, I believe, the JTS school, is that Zacharias Frankel accepted the academic study of Jewish history. And so Hirsch was very much against that, right? So Hirsch is funny because Hirsch obviously incorporates a lot of modern ideas into his Torah commentary. It is a great commentary, but the idea that, say, we can trace the evolution of rabbinic literature, and there's the Mishnaic Judaism and then Talmudic Judaism, and these changed, and there's some perceptible change. Hirsch was very against that. Unclear why, probably because he viewed it as a slippery slope, whereas the early conservative movement said, no, this is just, history and facts. We can still make the argument that Jewish law is relevant and binding, which they did, but for Hirsch, that was even a step too far. So that's why he's, yeah.
Was Frankel a contemporary of Hirsch? Were they living at the same time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you going to cover Frankel at some point in our learning?
I wasn't planning on it. I probably should. There's too many people.
Sorry.
So Hirsch, Frankel, and Geiger were all peers. They all probably knew each other. They corresponded, if not directly, indirectly, and they were all very much engaged in sort of similar projects. And so they're all just set mid 1800s. I just looked it up for the years. Zachariah Frankel lived from 1801 to 1875. Hirsch lived 1808 to 1888, and Geiger lived 1810 to somewhere in the 1870s.
Brothers.
And so they're all in Germany at the same time, duking it out here and sort of drawing these lines in the sand.
That would be a great play. You should write a play about the three of them having
Right
dinner over something. Anyway, I think Philip has his hand raised.
Go for it, Philip.
Hello, Rabbi. I'm in England, and I'm a Christian. I don't know whether I'm the only one in this group. And in fact, I'm a Catholic. And in fact, I'm a deacon in the Catholic Church, so I'm ordained. I just wanted to reassure you on some of the things you've said about some of Geiger's ideas and how they're received in the Catholic Church. They are pretty new, but one of the reasons I'm on this course is because I want to learn about Judaism. If you want to learn about Judaism, I think you ought to listen to Jews rather than other people who tell you what they think. Same applies with Roman Catholicism as well. Ask a Catholic what Catholics think. You probably get a better idea. I'm not saying your ideas are wrong. The idea that Jesus is a Jew, sometimes I remind my congregation that is true, and they're rather surprised, but they got used to it now. I do try and preach positively on Judaism and include some of the stuff I've learnt with the ALI and those sort of contacts. And the Christians in the pews in the church themselves receive it very warmly. One of my favorite speakers is Amy Jill Levine, and Jewish interpretation of the New Testament is always something I refer to when I'm studying things. And I would look at the latest relations between the Catholic Church and Jewish faiths across Jewish traditions, across all those Jewish traditions, Judaism in general. Recent statements, the last 10, 15 years, where the Catholic Church has said, yeah, we were wrong. The Jewish people the Jewish faith, Judaism is a legitimate faith. The Jews are the chosen people. They've no need to be turned into Christians. They have a role in this world. So do we. We'll work together. It's all right. Just to reassure you, it's not hostile.
No. I really appreciate it. It's funny because when you mentioned Amy Jill Levine, I turned around and this is a really interesting book. This was by two scholars, Amy Jill Levine, who you mentioned, and Mark Brutler, who wrote this book where they write side by side, how Jews and Christians read the same stories differently. And, it's really an incredible book. So no, I appreciate it. And thank you so much for coming in the comment.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. I think we will be back next week. I'll give you the little appetite for next week. I actually looked at the calendar and I was wrong. Marsha was right. Next week, we are going to talk about Zachariah Frankel and Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So I forgot about the calendar. So next week, we will dip into this, parallel, this today we can, the Reform movement, at least in 19th century Germany, was very antinomian, right? They were making the pitch that Judaism is not about action, it's about ideas. And that is going to be countered quite strongly by both the precursor to conservative and to modern Orthodox Judaism. So we'll read from both Frankel and Hirsch next week. We can talk a little bit about how and why Hirsch and Frankel disagreed, and I'm excited for that. So have a wonderful Monday and a wonderful week, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. And if you haven't been able to yet support this class, I hope you'll do so. You can do so on our website. We're glad to have you here, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Another great class.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.